All right, good evening, everybody. I wanted to start off just to kind of show where we are holding, so to speak, and then it's going to go off a screen share for quite a while. Put this on silent. That wasn't great. Okay. We are in Golden Age of Spain. We are in part two, and we discussed last week Dunashib and Labrat. If you followed up at all and you looked in your benchers on Shabbat, you will have seen some of the Zmirot that were written by him. Shlomo ibn Gvirol we talked about, and Bachya ibn Pakud, the Rebbeinu Bachya, most famous for some of his works. What we're going to do tonight, we're going to talk about Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Ibn Ezra. We won't touch the Rambam probably till middle of next week, is my guess. Yehuda Halevi will talk some, and Ibn Ezra quite a bit. There's a vast amount of material to discuss about both Ibn Ezra and Rambam, especially the Rambam. But even Ibn Ezra, when we get to it, we'll understand why. But for the beginning of the class, we're going to focus on Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and we know he lived in the late part of the 11th century and into the early part of the 12th century. Okay, so that's all you need to know at this moment before we begin. Again, we're talking about what's known as the Golden Age of Spain. And let me just get something here on my computer, get myself ready here. Okay. Sorry. Just have to get everything set up on my screen here. All right. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about his background, talk a little bit about Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's writings, and we're going to take a look at some of the things he has written that will, as I say, to impact us till this day. That's part of the goal for all these individuals, and especially when we talk about the Rambam, because that we're going to have to go into an additional discussion about how he impacts halacha. We'll get to that. Let's start with Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. So he's born in, again, this time period of the late 11th century, 1075. We're in Al-Andalus, which is the old term for the country of Spain, hence the name Andalusian music and other things. Exactly where he was born, evidently, is subject to debate, whether he was in Toledo or he was in Tudela. Right now, it doesn't make any difference to us. I mean, it made a difference to his family, but in any case, he had as a kid and as a young adult, he had a very mixed life. What do I mean by that? He had a very comprehensive education, seems to be the common thread with all these people who are the Golden Age of Spain personalities. And by the way, I'm mentioning we're talking about maybe 5 of them or dozens, but these are very bolet, very pronounced individuals. So he was schooled both in Hebrew and in Arabic and Greek sciences and philosophy and all kinds of stuff. And he was also heavily influenced by Jewish and Arabic Islamic cultures. What do I mean? He had a kind of a contradictory kind of an upbringing. We'll see that in a second. But just to talk a little bit about what it is that he did was he was a very big writer. That was his main claim to fame. What he wrote, how he wrote, what he wrote. We're going to see now. But what is it that he had such a conflict in his life that we'll see it more so by the Ibn Ezra, that he was so smart that people couldn't almost keep up with the amount of writing he did. His main issue was he wrote poetry. Now, that doesn't sound like okay, big deal, but he wrote different types of poetry, and some of which you're already aware of. We'll take a look at. He wrote various types of poetry. First was the secular poetry, which he wrote when he was younger, again, because he was very influenced by the culture where he was living. And in this secular poetry, meaning it's not themed necessarily by Torah, it would be celebrations, for example, of praising individuals, events, places. He also wrote elegies, which is a keynote, we would say in Hebrew, of poems about love, poems about marriage, heartbreak and loss. Some of them were very, very long, and some were very short, 2 lines, 3 lines. What he brought to the table and had a tremendous influence on that time period of writing and up till this very day was the way he wrote, meaning not just the words he used, but the patterns and the rhythms and his plays on words and his wit and his wisdom that came out. Again, we're only talking right now in his earlier life when it was the secular poetry. In addition to that, he was also very good at writing a small amount of words and bringing out tremendous amount of human emotion. So this is like, I'm not going to spend any more time on that because it's not really part of our long story here, but he was very much in the beginning of his life was already writing. I was in the National Library yesterday. I'll put a parentheses here for a second. I went there 3 weeks after the war began. And I went yesterday. My goal is to stand in front of every book that's on the stacks. And it's going to take years, literally, because each time I'm there's maybe a couple hours and I only get a little bit done. But I happened to be standing yesterday in front of all the writings of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, at least that were on the shelf. And it's like he was so prolific, and his impact on future writers, myself included, by the way. I follow more Ibn Ezra kind of writing. But in any case, so that was his secular writing. Let's talk about his religious writing. His poetry in religious writing, we'll talk of shirim, which are poems, piyutim, liturgical poetry. It came across a lot in his writing of his devotion to Hashem, his devotion to Bnei Israel, and the main one is his devotion to the land of Israel. Many of his poems are used in modern day Jewish liturgy in various parts of, not in tefillah per se, not the regular tefillah, regular davening, but is used as adjunct, whether it's in song, it's used in personal prayer. And there's a lot of writing that's spiritual connections and longing for God, longing for the people of Israel, longing for the land of Israel. And we're going to look at a couple of them that may be familiar to you already, one of which you know probably from a song. But his magnum opus, his major work, was the Kuzari. We spoke in the past about Khazaria, which was southern Russia, approximately. In approximately 200 years before this time period, talking about around the 10th century, where there was, I'm going to repeat this now because I said we're going to get to it. I'm getting to it now. I gave a short piece on it before. I'm going to get a little bit more expanded so you know what this book is. There was a country known as Khazaria that had a king whose name was Bulan, B-U-L-A-N, and he kept having a recurring dream. In this recurring dream, he was told, ostensibly by God, that your methods are right, or sorry, your desires are right, but your methods are wrong. And he took this to mean that because he was an idolater and his people were idolaters, and he took it to mean that he needs to change the religion of the country. And he made a decision that he would ask an imam, a priest, a philosopher, and a Jew about their religions. Philosophy not being a religion, but being a way of life. And whoever he felt was the most authentic and made the most sense, that's who he was going to go with. So he has the discussions, he calls each one in and has discussions with them about almost 2 centuries later. And he ends up choosing Judaism, and his people all convert to Judaism. There's not a lot known today about what exactly happened with all these people. Some theorize that they were the beginning of the Ashkenazi Jewry. We'll explore that later down the road. But what happened was he didn't really write. The king himself for sure did not write a written record of these discussions. It's not necessarily true that anyone, the rabbi who he calls in, doesn't necessarily write a written conversation or no exact transcript. But Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, what he does, there's different opinions of completely from his head. Is it just maybe based on some notes he had seen? Writes a book called the Kuzari, based on the word Chazaria, which was it portrays the discussions between the king and the Chaver being the rabbi in the story. Also, he mentions the priest and the imam and the philosopher. That takes about this much of the book, and the rest about that much is all about the Jews. It's broken down into 5 ma'amarim, 5 essays, the 5th of which is very difficult, especially the latter part. For those who learned it with me, you know that we kind of breezed through it because we only went parts of it. Supposedly around the 2nd ma'amar, the king decides in the story, the king decides already to convert to Judaism. And it's in English known as the Kuzari, the Defense of the Despised Religion. His goal in writing this book was not just to say, oh, I think this is probably what they discussed. It's a book of philosophy and conversation, a fictional portrayal, because he was not there. But what was his goal in this book was to present yet another book of Jewish philosophy. It's there to give us ideas of beliefs about land of Israel, God, resurrection of the dead, almost any Jewish topic you can think of, it's in there. It's in that book. Now, what I want to do is I want to show you two things before we go on about his biography. Show you two things that he wrote, Yehuda Halevi. Whoops, wrong. Not that. This screen. The other one I showed you comes later. Okay. The first thing I want to show you, I'll make this bigger. He writes a whole series of piyutim, liturgical poetry. They're called the Tzion piyutim. Some are read on Tisha B'Av, some are read at other times. There's books that people, and for those of you who grew up with the song, Tzion, 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 Halo Tisha Li. So that song is this poem, is this piyut. Tzion Halo Tisha Li, Lishlom Asirayach, Zion, why don't you inquire about the health, welfare of your captives? I'm not going through the whole thing, I'm just going to read a couple lines. Miyamu Mizrach Mitzafon Teman, Shalom. He's basically talking about the ingathering of the exiles from the four corners of the world. And he talks about this, that they're asirim, they're captives, they're outside of Israel, they should be in Israel. His whole desire, his whole mahut, his essence was to be in the land of Israel. Interestingly enough, there's a story that's told. It is apocryphal, meaning it's not necessarily true, but it could be true. But no one has ever verified it. That is that at the end of his life, he finally makes it to Israel, and he bends down on the ground to kiss the ground of Israel, and an Arab horseman runs him over and kills him. That's the supposed story. Whether it happened or not, I couldn't tell you. So this is one example of literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of poems. For those of you who are into modern day poetry, so Yehuda Amichai Zichrono Livracha was considered the poet laureate of Israel. A trivia question: where's the Yehuda Amichai Park? It's in Yerushalayim. Where is it? He wrote, like I say, prolific author. A lot of the themes having to do with Tzion, or the land of Israel, his yearning for the land of Israel. His most famous statement was, Libid b'mizrach v'anochi b'sof ma'arav. My heart is in the east, and I'm in the farthest area of the west. It wasn't that far. He was in Spain, and relative to Israel, but at that time period is far away. So the expression Libid b'mizrach, my heart is in the east, became almost a banner for people who yearned for the land of Israel. You will sometimes see that even on necklaces, you'll see it on jewelry, you'll see it in the beginning of books. I make reference to it partially in something I wrote, that big deal. So that's him. Where I want to share with you, those of you who learned the Kuzari will remember this. So this is the Libi b'mizrach. That was a part of a poem. Libi b'mizrach v'nochi b'sof ma'arav. Ech et ama et asher ochal ve'ech yerav. Echa shalem nedarai v'sarai. I'll explain in a moment. Be'od Tzion b'chevel Edom v'ani b'chevel Arav. Yekar be'inai azov kol tu Sfarad k'mo yekar be'inai ro'ot afrot dvir necharav. He is bemoaning the fact that he's not in Israel. He's bemoaning, how can I taste? No, in a metaphorical sense, that which I eat here, and how can I pay my vows and my promises while I'm still in Spain and I'm not where I'm supposed to be? And it's very beautiful, very poetic. But just this is the one that he's so much really known for. But when it comes to the next slide, some of you are aware of this. Okay, in the middle of the discussion with the king. The king is the Kuzari that you'll see here in Kaf Gimel, and the Rav is the Chaver. These are the two most beloved paragraphs in the entire book to me. I know these almost by heart because I've quoted them so many times because they're powerful. Just before this paragraph 23 in the second essay, the second mamar, the rabbi is telling the king how important the land of Israel is to the Jewish people. So the king says to him something that cuts him straight to the heart. Amar Kuzari, Im Kain, if it's so, that Israel is so important to you, you are shortening the requirements of your Torah. What does that mean? You're not living up to doing what you're supposed to do. You are not making this place, i.e. the land of Israel and the Beit HaMikdash, as your goal. Yet, you still say, and you believe that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is going to return there. If only if you believed that the Shekhinah is going to return there, then why is it for 900 years that you haven't done anything about it? You should be wanting this. You should be desiring this. So he's basically making fun of him. He's saying, give me a break. You keep telling me Israel's so important to you. And all you do is you think about Israel and you want the Beit HaMikdash. And then, give me a break. What have you done? You don't go to Israel. You're not doing anything Beit HaMikdash. It's all, what is it? We're going to see. 24. Kaf Dalet. Amar Chaver. Three words. Three words that in my book that I have, it's bolded, highlighted in the circle. Hovashtani Melech Kuzar. You have embarrassed me, my dear king. This sin, this is what's prevented us from really doing and completing what God set as a goal for us in the second Beit HaMikdash. As it says, if we wanted to, we would have done something about it. We would have gone back. Some people have gone back to Israel. Majority of them, remember, keep in mind what time period Yehuda Halevi is writing. He's writing at the end of the upswing of Bavel, which is now it's now already completely come down. And he's writing in the golden age of Spain. But now when he's writing this book as if it were contemporaneous to the time period of the time the story takes place, which is a couple hundred years earlier, which is still during the upswing of Bavel. And he's saying, what happened? What did we do wrong? We, the Jewish people, instead of the handful of people going to Israel, we should have all gone. And not only that, the majority of people have remained in Babylonia. Now, this I love. So this should be imprinted on the wall of every shul in Chutz La'aretz. Ve'ein diburenu, and what we say, the words we say are not. I'll explain what that means in a minute. Hishtachavu lahar kadsho, hishtachavu la'adam raglav, hamachazir shechina tov l'tzion. All these yearnings and wanting to bow down on the mountain of God and want to go to see the return of God's presence to the Har Habayit, b'zulat zeh, and other things. All these words, ein diburenu ela ketziftzuf hazarzir. It's only the twittering of birds. We don't even read, I'm paraphrasing. We don't seem to believe it. We don't do anything about it. What's he actually saying here? He's telling the king, meaning by extension, he's telling us, what in the world are we doing in Chutz La'aretz? That's Aleph. Bet, when we're in Chutz La'aretz and we say Hamachazir Shechina Tov L'Tzion and Bonei Yivaracham Ad Yerushalayim Amen, and we say V'Techazeh Einenu, etc. All that he said without doing something about it is only the twittering of birds. Now, let's put it more into context. He lives just a little bit before the time period of the Balei Tosafot. Balei Tosafot are the grandchildren, approximately, as far as generational, of Rashi. Now, let's back up a second. We're talking about Spain, and we're going to go all the way till about the expulsion to the late 1400s. Then we're going to backtrack and go through Europe, and we'll deal with Rashi then. But keep in mind where we're holding now. He is living at approximately just near the Rabbi Levi's around the early time, and then a little bit later, the Balei Tosafot. There's a Tosafot in Ketuvot. It's famous page in Ketuvot because people use it to prove that you should make Aliyah and to prove you shouldn't make Aliyah. Trust me, because I've in the past I've given a shir on multiple shirim on this, and I've given it online here. It's available on YouTube if you want, about Mitzvat Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. And everyone talks about this one Tosafot. There's a Tosafot in, I think it's Kuf Yud Bet on page 112. Zerash a Tosafot that says Rabbeinu Yerucham says that there's no mitzvah to make Aliyah because it's sakanat drachim, because the traveling there is extremely dangerous. And there's all kinds of explanations. First of all, it's a dat yachid, it's a single opinion, and it's no longer dangerous. But why am I mentioning that? Because if it was dangerous in that time period, it was. Yet Rabbi Yehuda Levi saw it important enough to put into his book the Kuzari the extreme importance. He's bemoaning the fact Jews aren't making Aliyah. He's bemoaning the fact that all the people we're doing in Chutz La'aretz is saying the words and don't necessarily mean them. That was then. What about today? Today, more dangerous to be in Chutz La'aretz. Okay? We're not going to digress into politics, but to live in Chutz La'aretz right now, just look at the pogrom that was taking place the other day in LA outside a show where my nephew learns every day, and I know that my brother Davis already goes to town sometimes. So Mamasha pogrom, and all the anti-Semitism that's growing around the world, and it takes the cost of a plane ticket unless you're making Aliyah and it's free, and we'll stay in Chutz La'aretz and we'll still say the same words, and the words of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi back then apply right now. Today, they applied in the 1800s, the 1900s, the 2000s, the 2024. It applies. It continues to apply. If it applied back then, when things were difficult, that Israel was not, you didn't have Nefesh B'Nefesh, you didn't have the early days of Israel, of the Merkazei Klita, you didn't have all these things. You had very tough times, and yet he still said that Hovashtani Melech Kuzar, you've embarrassed me. Keep in mind again that his whole essence was the land of Israel. That's what he was so enamored with and in love with. So the reason we spend time on Rabbi Yehuda Levi, who's only a poet, is his impact on the love of Israel and what it can do for all of us and for future generations. Bezrat Hashem. Okay. I'm going to just take a look. One more point here. I think I just need to reiterate one more thing. On Tisha B'Av, now this year it's not going to apply anymore because we're obviously getting very close to Mashiach here. In my mind, there's no question. So hopefully this year, Tisha B'Av, you'll come for Kiddush to my house. At Bo Bayom, meat, wine, freely flowing. And if you're a vegan or vegetarian, you can have all the chickpeas you want and flaxseed. And that has to do with his connection to Tisha B'Av, Rabbi Yehuda Levi. I kind of glossed over it before. I'm going to spend one more minute on it. There are many, for those of you who know a little bit about the kinot, the elegies that we say at night, the 5 or so at night, more for Sfaradim, and then by the day, the ones that we say by day, you'll know that there's certain names that come up if you have an art scroll or something else, you look at the names of the authors, you'll see probably the most famous, the most well-known is Rabbi Yehuda HaKalir. HaKalir was the prime author of most kinot. Rashi wrote some because he lived at the time of the early days of the Crusades. So he wrote about that. You have the spire, worms, and vermais. You have all kinds of interesting things. But near the end, and especially by Sfaradim, there's multiple poems of Rabbi Yehuda Levi, of the Tzion kinot, that are there. Why? Again, because what's Tisha B'Av all about? It's about what we lost and what we want. We lost the Beit HaMikdash. We lost our shlita, our rule over Har HaBayit in Yerushalayim. We were thrown out. We were put into Galut again. And what was his whole mahut again? Was getting it back and yearning for that. And that's why when you see and you open up a keynote booklet for Tisha B'Av, again, it's going to be, this year it's going to be we'll have a nice big Geniza burial. Why his poems are so bolate, so pronounced in that particular part of the liturgy. Okay, so I don't want to continue to beat a dead horse. Just want to look at my notes here for a second. There's one point I didn't make before, at least I was too brief, and that is we talked about the land of Israel, we talked about the people of Israel, we talked about the Torah of Israel, but also the people of Israel. What runs as a theme through a lot of his writings is the chosenness of Am Yisrael. They were the Am HaNivchar, the chosen people. Again, it sounds like a commercial for Bnei Akiva or World Mizrahi, which is Eretz Yisrael, Torah Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Torah Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, Torah Yisrael, whatever. You know what I'm talking about. It's the land of Israel, the people of Israel, the Torah of Israel. That is what he encompassed in all of his writings as well. Okay, so what we're going to do, we are going to put Rabbi Yehuda Halevi aside right now. And we're going to start on a bit of an adventure, go down a little bit of an adventure, and start talking about our next individual, and that is Avraham ben Meir ibn Ezra, also just known as Ibn Ezra. It is I've said this before, it's a pet peeve of mine that people say Evan Ezra. That's as bad as saying my name's Vez instead of Zev. It's not the name. Ibn, as I said to you before, whoever will listen to me, means Ben, son of, in Arabic. So it's Avram ben Meir ibn Ezra. So his name is Ibn Ezra for short. That's how he's known. Sometimes he's known by his Rashi Tevot, the initials of his name. So let's start talking about him, and we're going to talk extensively about him. I have many, many pages of notes that I want to go through. We will also look at some of his work. Well, as I've been doing, talk not only about his life, but also about his writings and how they impact us today. He truly had a conflicted youth. And he's born in Tudela in Spain in 1089. Again, I'm throwing out these dates because just you should get a time period reference, late 11th century. He becomes a renowned poet, grammarian, philosopher, astronomer. He's very much into math, all these different areas of brilliance. And that is going to have a tremendous impact on his approach to Torah. I'm going to kind of jump from the beginning to the end for 1 second. He was very much into tachlis. What do I need to know? What do I need to do? How do I accomplish that? And when we get to it, we talk about how he differs from other commentators. One of the biggest things is he's into pshat. When you see a pasuk, what does it mean? I don't want to know the midrash. I don't want to know, well, if we stand on our head, we turn this letter backward. No, tell me, what does the pasuk mean? And drill down as deep as you can in pshat. Where does that come from? It comes from his early days of schooling, because this is how he is schooled. This is how he's trained, not just in Torah, but in all the areas that he learns in, again, whether it's math or science or philosophy. The flip side of all this, you'd think, boy, he must have come from a very wealthy family and he was on the top of the pile. So we've seen already a couple of individuals, whether it was Ibn Gvirol or others, who came from very wealthy families and they were able to afford private tutors and they were able to go to school. He, on the other hand, how he got his education, I can't tell you because it doesn't seem to be recorded, but it's actually shocking that he was able to accomplish all this, because most of his life he was poor. And even as a child, he grew up in a poor house. He made some money by tutoring children. He must have worked for the Misrad HaChinuch. Don't make any money in school, you go private teaching. In addition to that, because he knew Arabic and Hebrew and other languages, he also worked for some wealthy people, translating some of the writings, some of the books they had. He even, when we talk about what he wrote, you'll see that almost every time he has a commentary in a book, whether it's Eicha or Torah or something like that, he has an introduction that's written in a poetic fashion. Every parasha is introduced in the Torah, is introduced with a little poem. Sometimes it's one line, sometimes it's a few lines. But in Eicha, his introduction, he even mentions, I'm going to read you in English, I have it here, a quote. It says, "These books of mine in my exile were holding my hands." What does that mean? It meant that the writing these books allowed him to make a living when he would translate for others and also when he started to write his own commentary. But the fact that he was so poor, everything he touched fell apart. He had terrible luck. He said, one of his probably the most famous line he has ever said and written, I don't remember where he wrote it, that if he sold burial shrouds, people would stop dying. That's how poor off his luck was. So everyone, of course, hears this, oh, you should have sold burial shrouds. Anyways, so we're going to divide his life into two parts. There's the time he's born, which is 1089 till 1140. And then from that point till his death. Going to be two specific time periods, and we're going to see why it's broken down like that. So I'm going to start off by talking about his early days. My notes over. Okay. Again, in the first part of his life, he lives in Spain. One of the things I remember when I was teaching in the past, teaching about Ibn Ezra, less in depth than I am this time, was that he was one of the rabbis at the time that traveled not because he wanted to, but because he had to. And he traveled far and very widely to multiple countries. We will see why. But right now he's in Spain. He grows up in Spain. He gets, like I told you, this pretty wide or broad education. He's fluent in Arabic. He's fluent in Hebrew. He's fluent in culture, meaning the rich Muslim culture. Remember, keep in mind, they're still under the rule of the Muslims at this point. It's going to change while he's alive. And it's during this time period, just like Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, when he was younger, he wrote almost completely secular poetry. And then he switched to more Jewish-oriented. Same thing happened with Ibn Ezra. When he was younger, much of what he wrote was secular. This, by the way, the Rambam never gets to that. He's always, everything about him, by 18 years old, he writes one of his biggest works, the commentary on the Mishnayot. I was lucky at 18 if I knew how to find them on the bookshelf. Anyways, so Ibn Ezra had a family. Don't know very much about it. He had a wife and 5 children. Again, he had a terrible life. His wife and 4 of his children died at a young age. His surviving son, Yitzchak, actually had a relationship or friendship, I should say, with Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. How and why, I don't know. I've not found any source as to the why. Apparently, his son Yitzchak converted to Islam. Now, if you think that that's so unusual, in almost every single life of every gadol that you can name, including Lubavitcher Rebbe, Zecher Tzadik V'Kadosh Livracha, and many others, there have been people within the immediate family who've either become an apostate, completely became atheist, they became Christian, they became Muslim. Lahavdil, I mean, Herzl, Zichrono Livracha, was not religious by any stretch of the imagination, but he had most of his family converted to Christianity, and many his children, and suicide in the family also as a result of this conflict of the religion. But he, Ibn Ezra, you take a Chumash, Mikrot Gedolah, you open up, and you read Rashi, and you read the Ibn Ezra's commentary. You don't necessarily, if you don't know any background, you don't understand under what circumstances this man was writing all of his works, that he loses his wife, he loses 4 of his children, they die young, and another son converts to Islam. He's out there alone, all this terrible luck and all these things that are going wrong with him. So what happens is, at this point in 1140, so we separated his life into 2 parts. At the second period of his life, so the first part is all this, a lot of early writing, a lot of secular writing. He starts to travel to Christian part of Spain, not because of anything that's happening terrible, but as things are starting to bubble over, the Muslim Spain is being conquered and by the Almohad. And this is causing some upheaval in the country, and he sees the writing on the wall. He decides to move to a different area within the country, which is more Christian. He stays there for a short period of time. Then he goes to Rome. Why Rome? Because it's not ancient even. We're not talking ancient, we're talking Middle Ages. In Rome was a city that was filled with scholars and, for his needs, a tremendous amount of books. Remember, books are all handwritten still at this time period of history. They can be scrolls or books as we know them, but they're all handwritten. There's no such thing yet as a printing press for another 400 years almost. And when he does leaves Spain to go to Rome, that is out of clear danger to his life. He's afraid, and he actually writes about it as part of his poetry. What's interesting about Ibn Ezra, and it comes out with other authors as well, that their lives, especially with Yehuda Halevi also, their lives enter their writing. So with a lot of they write about, sometimes it's the Fidah. They write about like almost in a hidden way. You have to kind of understand the backstory, like why is he even saying that? So Jews in medieval Europe, where he's now finding himself in Rome, they don't know Arabic. So what he does, he decides to take upon himself translating the works of Spanish scholars. And he supports himself financially by doing this translation, just like he did back in Spain. And he also maintains a Spanish culture, even after the culture in Spain is being crushed and destroyed. He sees himself actually as keeping Spanish culture alive. Not just Jewish Spanish culture, but the culture of Spain of that time period. So now, not only does he translate things about grammar. Remember, we learned about Rabbi Yehuda ibn Chayuj was his name. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Who was like really one of the big grammarians of the time. He takes some of his stuff. He starts to translate that. And he's translating now also into books of grammar for European Jews. He understood that their knowledge of Hebrew was, let's just say, appalling. And he felt he had to take it upon himself as a grammarian. He grew up that language was critical. Hebrew was critical, not just for understanding the texts, but because it's who we are as Jews. It was an association with Judaism. And therefore, he felt it was necessary to make sure that the common person living at that time in Europe, but especially where he is now in Rome, understand Hebrew, can write Hebrew, can read Hebrew. For him, it's also good because then he can sell more books, but that's not his goal. He stresses the importance to be precise in the Hebrew language. And he even complains about the speech of Ashkenazi Jews. We will return down the road to the split between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jewry, but we know that this time period, rather, there's Ashkenazi Jewry and Sephardi Jewry. He writes many works. One's called Perush HaKatzar to the Torah. He writes a commentary on Nevi'im. He writes a book called Sefer HaIbur, which has to do with calendar. It has to do with making sure people understand how to calculate things in the calendar. He doesn't actually stay. He writes a tremendous amount. He's a super influential in the community in Rome, but he doesn't stay there very long. And he starts to wander through different towns in Italy. From Italy, he goes to France, to the south of France. Now we're in 1148. It's possible that he's having issues because of the influence of the Second Crusades on the Jews of Italy. Even if you don't know very much about the Crusades, let's just say it wasn't a very good time for the Jews. In Hebrew, they're called the Tsalbanim, for the word Slav, cross. So even though the Crusades didn't really pass through Italy, the initiative of the Crusades came out of Italy. There was a man named Godfrey de Bouillon. Ooh, wow. Talk about really pulling something out for the back of the head. In 1095, he made an edict, and it started to be put into practice in 1096 of the idea of going to the Holy Land to redeem it from the infidels, meaning the Jews, the Muslims, the Christians were going to take over. if you're familiar with the word hotel and hospital, when we talk about the Crusades, those words are going to take a different meaning. In any case, because the Crusades, the time period, the Second Crusades now, he doesn't necessarily feel welcome or appreciated. There's a lot of anti-Semitism going on still as a result of the Crusades. He does feel still a responsibility to transfer a lot of the knowledge from Spain to the area of Italy. In a similar vein, we saw this back in Bavel, that when especially at the time of the Gaonim, that people were writing letters back and forth, literally from around the world, to these scholars in Bavel, to the Gaonim, and they were this way teaching, passing information along, teaching them Torah, answering questions. He's taking like it's almost a one-man crusade to this part of the world, i.e. Italy before that, in Bigadol in Italy, but in Rome and other cities, and now in France. What's interesting is that in southern France, as opposed to Italy, where he wasn't so appreciated, in southern France, they embraced him. They were excited about his innovations. They appreciated his contributions. And some of them had to do, believe it or not, with astrology and astronomy. If you were to take the average top tier series of rabbis in the world right now, Haredi, Dati Leumi, whatever it might be, and you were to ask them about astrology, astronomy, mathematics, you will have, for sure, within the Dati Leumi world, take a look, for example, at Rabbi David Zatzal, from the Gush. My mind just went blank. Of Soloveitchik's son-in-law. In any case, Rabbi Lichtenstein, these people they knew. I mean, they had doctorates in Rabbi David Zatzal was electrical engineering, and if you look at some of his writings, it looks like Chinese. But the average person, the average gadol, so to speak, won't be able to do the astrology, the astronomy, the mathematics. This was very common at this time period because, again, you're also talking about it's coming to the Renaissance time period. You're talking about this rebirth and this renewal of knowledge. It's going to tie into the church losing controls. Like all these things come together. And that's why someone like Ibn Ezra has this tremendous amount of knowledge. Now, I'm going to stop here because at this point, starting 1152, he starts moving on a little bit more into northern France, and he starts working more towards his commentaries and things that we were more familiar with. I'm going to spend some time with that next week on his continued travels, on his writings. We'll take a look at some of those things, and maybe still next week get to the Rambam. All right. I think I have given enough information to you tonight, I hope. Maybe too much. And wish you all good evening. Stay cool, drink plenty, and have a great evening.